My guest is Barry Rubin. He's the head of Gloria, a center of research on the Middle East, and he's also the editor of Maria. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Barry, you're an expert on Turkey, and Turkey is very central to Middle East politics. And I recall 10 or 12 years ago reading something of yours on the economic crisis in Turkey. Did that set up the modern shift toward Islam in Turkey, the kind of economic collapse that happened in the beginning of this century?
Well, it helped bring the current government to power, but what has motivated this are deeper structural shifts, and actually, in some ways, not economic failure, but economic success. There was the rise of a lot of businesses run by people who became very wealthy outside of the main cities, outside of Istanbul, and these people were more traditional and Islamic oriented, and they funded the movements, and they're called the Anatolian Tigers, for example. So there were social and structural shifts in the country. Massive migrations from the countryside to the city also played a factor, because historically Turkey was run by the more modernized and somewhat westernized cities, as I say, especially Istanbul and Ankara. And so this is the interior, what they call in Turkish discussion the periphery.
So did they sort of combine losing their traditional attachments and then held on to it stronger, as happens often in migration?
Yes, but Turkey also has a lot of secondary cities too. So it's not all people coming to the big cities. It's also the interior of the country. The further east you go in Turkey, the more traditional and religious oriented it becomes. But there are other factors, the brilliance of some of the younger politicians who saw that the old, very obviously doctrinaire and extreme kind of politics didn't work. That was a factor. The disorganization of the other parties, which continues. I given as an example that after losing the election, one of the non-Islamist Turkish politicians was asked on television why his party lost the election, and he said because the voters are stupid. And well, there's this kind of arrogant bureau, because these people basically were in power for 70 years.
Right.
So there were a number of factors involved. But absolutely critical was that the AKP, the ruling party now, successfully presented itself as a moderate center-right party of family values and not as an Islamist party.
Was that just a cover?
Well, there was a big debate on this. Now, speaking from the perspective today, yes, I would say it was a cover.
Because it's clearly shifted much beyond that.
Well, I wish it was clear to a lot of other people, because in fact, a lot of people in the West still don't understand this. But the more they won elections, the longer they were in power, the more they came out and expressed their true views. And what they're engaged in is a transformation of the country and its institutions to transform the bureaucracy, to take control of the army, which they're trying to do, to change the judiciary system.
But I thought they also got
so
control of the deep structures, the intelligence services and all those, the security services on the deeper level.
Yes, and the police. But it's an ongoing process. And I mean, to give you an example, women are being pushed out of high positions. People in the bureaucracy know that if your wife wears a headscarf, you're more likely to be promoted. They're giving a college accreditation to the graduates of Islamic schools on an equal basis with universities so that they can take high positions in the bureaucracy. It's a very clever and comprehensive strategy. We haven't seen anything approaching it, I think, in any other country.
But this is critical for Israel because Turkey was its ally in a way, and now
yes,
it's clearly gone to the other side, I think, to me anyway. Is that...
Yeah.
It hasn't joined quite the Iran axis, but there's indications that they're moving closer.
Well, the funny thing is that some of the things between Turkey and Israel are still very much in place. You see, the regime wants the military. Well, the regime wants trade to continue. It's very important for them, but the real losers here is the U.S. and the West, although they don't notice it, because Turkey is no longer a reliable partner for them on things like Iraq, Iran. I mean, when I say when the Turkish government is closer to Iran than it is to the United States, this is a cause for deep concern. But I can tell you that people in Washington are oblivious to this. They haven't recognized it yet, that this is happening. They're still taken in by the facade. And in fact, they've given aid and comfort to the existing regime. And this is a tragic situation, although it mirrors some of the other things that are going on. A lot of this stuff isn't even reported. You have a situation in which the government now controls 30% of the media. The main media group that's opposed to them, the Doyan group, they took to court and they wanted to fine them several $billion, not $1 million, on alleged tax stuff.
The Russian pattern of taking over the media.
Well, yes. And unless they give in, and people are intimidated. And again, this is happening almost unnoticed in the West. So when the official Syrian government newspaper says we now are moving toward an alliance, which is an anti-American, anti-Israel alliance between Iran, Syria, and Turkey, and there's like no consciousness that this is happening, then that's a serious matter.
Well, there's surely a consciousness in Israel anyway of the shift.
Sure.
And especially after the Gaza war.
Yes, but you see what happens is then when you talk about this in places like Washington, they say, oh, it's just on the issue of Israel because, they're upset about Gaza. So they don't understand that it affects everyone. Look, I mean, one doesn't want to make facile analogies to the 1930s. One has to be careful. But in one respect, I think it does apply. And that's the and in a sense, in the immediate post-World War II with the Soviet Union, that a growing threat exists, and that the people whose job it is to protect us from it are blind to at least in the real way that it is, blind to the existence of that threat, and following a strategy which puts more emphasis on reconciling the radicals and the people who are the threat than supporting the people who are being threatened.
But perhaps they're just waiting, because if they watch the polls, I mean, if I read them right, the AKP went from 32% when it first got elected, I don't remember, to 47%?
28%. Correct.
But now they're way back down in the polls, I understand.
Well, the problem, but given the Turkish system and the problems of the opposition, you can win an overwhelming landslide election with like 30%. So they're going to be in power for the foreseeable future, and they're entrenching themselves in power. But when I say that they're blind to it, I mean you talk to policymakers and diplomats, and they simply say, "No, this isn't true." I'm speaking from a position of authority on this specific point.
But have they so decimated with the judicial attacks and the arrests of military officers that the military are now incapacitated to defend Kemalism?
Well, they have a
secular society.
Well, they have a number of problems. First of all, the military knows that it cannot depend on Western support, and when there are discussions held, they're discouraged. They know that the West supports the government, not them. In addition to that, remember that the European Union has kept pressing to reduce the role of the military in Turkish life. And they know that the government has a strong base of support. They don't want to set off a civil war. So the transformation of the army into a tame instrument for the government has definitely not been completed, but it's in process. And what they're doing is the government is creating phony conspiracies that they then use to arrest officers or intimidate people. And people start to realize that their career will benefit if they go along with the government. And there are many people who then will do so. That's true in all sectors of life. But it's a very serious and dangerous situation. And as I say, it may seem hard to believe, but it's really going unnoticed.
Well, thank you again, Barry. We'll have to explore this with other countries, because it's the same theme that seems to be running through it, is not paying enough attention to supporting moderates and too much supporting indirectly the Islamists.
Thank you.
But we'll return to that.
Intimacy, the ultimate closeness between two human beings. And I want to share with you an intimacy that was not between two human beings and the attendant loneliness that comes with that. It's the story of Moses, who I would argue was the loneliest man on the planet. He left his parents' home when he was simply a baby put in the river. He grows up in someone else's home, although, yes, it was Pharaoh's palace. He then has to leave his homeland. He comes back 80 years later, and he returns to his own people who reject him, and he takes them out of the land of Egypt, and then they reject him, and consistently, and then he makes his way up to the mountain, and this is the narrative of the text. Don't worry about it, whether it's a religious narrative or not now. Let's just look at the story as though it's being told by a storyteller. Up to the mountain, 40 days with God, comes back, gives them 10 commandments, and shortly thereafter, he separates from the people. He has this glow about him. He can't handle the people. And for almost 38 years, he's kind of separated. He's outside the camp. And then, in his final dying days, God says to him, go up and look across the sea, across the river. You're not going across there. You're dying here. And not only are you dying here, I'm going to take you to your dying place, and you're going to be buried. Only I will know where you die. Moses died, the loneliest man on the planet, but with the deepest, most intimate relationship. And here's how. Moses encountered God. Moses was encountered by God. Moses understood that God had need of him, and Moses learned that God has need of people. The truth of that story is that each and every one of us can encounter God, be encountered by God, recognize that God needs to encounter us, but most importantly, that God is willing to encounter each and every one of us as we are. Which means that maybe God is not what we think God is. Maybe God is all around us. Maybe God is present in everything. And we are constantly and consistently encountering God without the big theophany on the mountain that we have, the big God voice. Moses recognized that leadership inherently can be lonely. But each of us in our own individual lives, as we experience the intimacy of a possible connection to God, look at your human relationships. Imagine if you know someone who needs you, you need them, they want you to need them, and you want to need them, and they'll accept you the way you are. That's intimacy.
I do hope you enjoyed tonight's show. We aspire to provide high quality as well as entertaining and objective programming that will inform, enlighten, and enrich the public's knowledge of Israel and the Jewish world. Comments are always welcome. So our memberships, please join. I hope you'll tune in next week. I'm Howard Edelman. Good night until then.